My husband looked at me across the kitchen island we'd picked together 34 years earlier and laughed. You'd never survive without me, Tara. The room went silent. My son stared down at his plate. My daughter-in-law pretended to check her phone. And just like that, I realized I had spent half my life disappearing for people who would watch me break without saying a word. Daniel slid the divorce papers toward me with a smug smile, certain I would beg him to stay. Instead, I signed them. What he didn't know was that I had already found the one thing he could never take from me. If this story touches your heart in any way, don't forget to like and subscribe. And please tell me in the comments, what would you have done if the person you loved most looked you in the eyes and said you were nothing without them? I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I read every single comment. People always think a marriage falls apart in one dramatic moment. A screaming match, an affair, a slammed door. But looking back now, I think my marriage died quietly, slowly, like water dripping into a crack until the whole foundation gives way beneath your feet. When I met Daniel Robertson, I was 27 years old and working at a small bakery in downtown Columbus, Ohio. Back then, he had this easy smile that made every room feel warmer. He was ambitious, charming, and the kind of man who remembered tiny details. The first time he brought me flowers, he remembered my favorite color was yellow. Not red, not pink, yellow. That mattered to me. I grew up believing love was built from small things. Daniel used to sit at the counter while I worked the morning shift. He'd order coffee he didn't even drink just so he could talk to me longer. You belong somewhere bigger than this place, he used to tell me. And God help me. I believed him. We married less than a year later. For a while, life felt beautiful. We bought a modest house in a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus. Daniel worked in commercial insurance sales and I continued baking. Every Sunday morning, the whole house smelled like cinnamon rolls and butter. We danced in the kitchen. We laughed over burned casseroles. We stayed up late talking about the future. Then Ethan was born, and everything began to shift so gradually, I almost didn't notice it happening. At least one of us should stay home, Daniel told me when Ethan was 6 months old. It'll save money on daycare. It sounded reasonable, temporary. Daniel promised it wouldn't be forever. You can always go back to work later, Tara. So I stayed home. I packed lunches. I attended parent-teacher meetings. I scrubbed mud from soccer uniforms at midnight. I remembered birthdays, prescriptions, school projects, allergies, dentist appointments, and every tiny invisible detail that kept our family functioning. And slowly, Daniel stopped seeing any of it as work. He started calling himself the provider. At first, it was harmless. Then it became something else. One night at dinner, maybe 15 years ago, I remember asking if we could replace the old washing machine because it kept flooding the laundry room. Daniel sighed dramatically and said, "Tara, do you know how hard I work for money?" Ethan was maybe 14 then. He laughed, not cruelly, just automatically, like it was normal. I laughed too. That's the part that hurts most now. I helped teach my son that disrespecting me was acceptable. Over the years, Daniel became the center of everything in the house. His schedule mattered most. His stress mattered most. His opinions became facts. And mine became interruptions. If I bought something for myself, he questioned it. You really needed that. If I forgot something minor, he'd shake his head. What would you do without me? At first, he said it jokingly. Then he stopped joking. By the time I turned 60, I realized something terrifying. I couldn't remember the last time someone asked what I wanted. Not what I cooked, not what I planned, not what I organized, what I wanted. Daniel had become successful by then. Very successful. We moved into a larger home with granite countertops and tall windows that looked perfect from the outside. He drove a black Mercedes. People respected him. At church gatherings, neighbors praised him constantly. "You're lucky to have a man like Daniel." I heard that sentence for years. Lucky, as if comfort erased humiliation, as if a nice house could replace dignity. The strange thing about emotional cruelty is that it rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There are no bruises to photograph, no police reports, just tiny cuts, tiny humiliations, tiny moments that pile up until you barely recognize yourself. One afternoon, I remember standing in our bedroom holding a department store bag. I'd bought myself a sweater on clearance. $40. Daniel looked at the receipt and frowned. $40 for a sweater. I stared at him. He had purchased a new golf club set that same week worth nearly $2,000. But somehow my sweater required justification. "I just thought it looked nice," I said quietly. He shook his head. "You don't understand money, Tara." That sentence stayed with me for years. You don't understand money. Meanwhile, I was the one stretching grocery budgets. I was the one clipping coupons when Ethan was younger. I was the one who gave up every dream I had so Daniel could build his career uninterrupted. But somehow, none of that counted. By the time Ethan married Melissa, the family dynamic had already been carved in stone. Melissa was polished, pretty, and careful with her words. She never openly insulted me. In some ways, that made it worse. She watched Daniel belittle me and learned quickly which side held power. "Daniel works so hard," she'd say admiringly at family dinners. Meanwhile, I'd spent 6 straight hours cooking the meal sitting in front of her. One Thanksgiving, I remember carrying dishes to the table while everyone watched football. Daniel glanced toward the kitchen and chuckled. Tara would die if she had to work a real job again. Everyone laughed lightly, even Ethan. Something inside me cracked a little that night. Not loudly, quietly, like ice splitting under pressure. The older I got, the more invisible I became, except when Daniel needed something. Then suddenly, I mattered again. "Tara, where's my blue tie? Tara, did you pay the electric bill? Tara, why isn't dinner ready yet?" I became a function instead of a person. And somehow, I let it happen. That's the part I still wrestle with. People ask why women stay in marriages like that. The answer is complicated. Sometimes you stay because you remember who they used to be. Sometimes you stay because you're afraid. Sometimes you stay because after decades of being told you can't survive alone, you start believing it too. But deep down, something had started changing in me, long before the divorce papers hit the kitchen counter. I began noticing little things. Daniel taking phone calls outside, closing laptop screens when I entered the room, stacks of financial documents disappearing from drawers. One afternoon, while cleaning his office, I found a bank envelope shoved beneath a pile of magazines. I almost ignored it. I wish I had, because the moment I opened it, my entire marriage shifted beneath my feet. The account balance showed over $300,000, in Daniel's name only. My hands started shaking. We had always shared finances, or at least, I thought we had. But that wasn't even the worst part. The mailing address connected to the account wasn't our home. It was a private P.O. box downtown. And suddenly, after 34 years of marriage, I realized I had no idea who my husband really was. I didn't confront Daniel about the bank account right away. At first, I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was a retirement account. Maybe it was business-related. Maybe I was overreacting. Women like me become experts at explaining away bad behavior. After enough years, denial starts sounding like survival. So I folded the statement carefully and placed it back exactly where I'd found it. Then I waited. And once you start paying attention to someone who's been lying to you, You notice everything. Daniel guarded his phone like it contained nuclear codes. He stepped outside to take calls. He smiled at messages he never mentioned. Sometimes he came home late smelling like expensive cologne that wasn't his usual brand. Still, somehow, none of that hurt as much as what happened the following Sunday. That was the night something inside me finally died. Ethan and Melissa came over for dinner around 6. I spent most of the afternoon cooking because that's what I always did. Pot roast, garlic mashed potatoes, homemade rolls, peach cobbler. Daniel loved peach cobbler. Or at least he used to. I remember standing in the kitchen brushing melted butter over the rolls when Melissa walked in carrying a bottle of wine. "Oh, wow," she said, looking around. "You really went all out." I smiled politely. I thought it'd be nice. She nodded, already distracted by her phone. Through the doorway, I could hear Daniel talking loudly to Ethan in the living room about golf memberships and stock investments. The same conversation they always had lately. Money, success, status. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and carried the food to the dining table. For a moment, looking at the plates and candles and polished silverware, I felt something dangerously close to sadness. I had spent decades creating warmth for people who no longer noticed it. Dinner started normally enough. Melissa complimented the potatoes. Ethan talked about work. Daniel drank more wine than usual. And every time Daniel drank too much, he became louder. Meaner. Like the version of himself he normally kept hidden, finally stopped pretending. At some point, Ethan mentioned rising grocery prices. Daniel laughed and leaned back in his chair. "Good thing I handled the finances all these years," he said. "Your mother would have bankrupted us by the 90s. Melissa laughed softly. Ethan smirked into his drink. And just like that, the familiar humiliation settled over the table. Normally, I would have smiled weakly and changed the subject. That's what I always did. But that night, something felt different. Maybe because of the bank statement. Maybe because I was finally exhausted from swallowing every insult. "I managed our household just fine," I said quietly. Daniel looked genuinely surprised that I'd responded. Then he chuckled. "Tara, come on." He waved his wine glass carelessly. "You couldn't survive without me, and we both know it." The room went still. I felt Melissa glance toward Ethan awkwardly. Daniel kept going. "That's not an insult, sweetheart. It's reality. Sweetheart." I had started hating that word years ago. "You haven't worked a real job in over 30 years, he continued. "You wouldn't last a month on your own." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Not one word. I looked at my son, the little boy I used to rock to sleep when he had nightmares, the child whose lunches I packed every single morning for 12 years, and realized he had learned to measure my value through his father's eyes. And somehow, that hurt more than Daniel's cruelty ever could. Melissa cleared her throat. "Well, the world's harder now than it used to be." There it was, agreement wrapped in politeness. Daniel smiled smugly. "Exactly." He pointed toward me with his fork. "Your mother's had a comfortable life because I provided it. As if I had contributed nothing. As if unpaid labor wasn't labor. As if raising a child, running a household, supporting his career, hosting his business dinners, organizing his life, and sacrificing every dream I once had meant absolutely nothing because no paycheck came with it. I stared down at my plate because I knew if I looked directly at him, I might cry. And I refused to cry in front of Daniel anymore. Not after all these years. "You know what the funny part is?" Daniel said, laughing lightly. "Tara still thinks she'd make it on her own." He looked around the table for validation. Melissa gave an uncomfortable smile. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. Then Daniel delivered the sentence that changed everything. "She'd never survive without me. Not might not. Not probably not. Never. Like I was helpless. Weak. useless. I suddenly became aware of the ticking kitchen clock behind me, the hum of the refrigerator, the smell of rosemary from the roast. All those ordinary little details burned themselves into my memory because deep down, I think part of me knew my marriage ended in that moment. Not because Daniel insulted me. He'd done that for years. It ended because everyone else let him. I slowly set down my fork. No one spoke, and then to my own surprise, I smiled. A small smile. Calm. That seemed to confuse Daniel more than anger would have. "You're right," I said softly. The entire table looked up. Daniel blinked. "What?" "You're absolutely right," I repeated. His expression shifted with satisfaction, like he'd won something. But inside me, something cold and sharp had finally awakened. Because for the first time in decades, I stopped trying to defend myself to people determined not to see me clearly. Dinner ended awkwardly after that. Melissa offered to help clean up, but I told her I'd handle it. Daniel and Ethan returned to the living room to watch football as if nothing had happened. As if humiliation were normal. As if mothers didn't bleed internally too. I stood alone at the sink, washing dishes, while laughter echoed faintly from the television in the other room. My hands shook slightly as warm water ran over them. 34 years. 34 years of loving a man who needed me small in order to feel big. I heard footsteps behind me and turned. Melissa stood awkwardly near the kitchen doorway. For a second, she looked almost guilty. Then she lowered her voice. "Don't take what Daniel says personally." I stared at her. "He just worries about you." I nearly laughed. "Worries about me. That's what they called control now." Melissa hesitated before continuing. "He says, you've never really handled life on your own." Something about the way she said it made my stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" I asked quietly. Melissa looked uncomfortable immediately. "Nothing." "No," I said carefully. "What exactly has Daniel been saying?" Her eyes widened slightly, realizing she'd revealed too much. But it was already too late. She looked toward the living room before whispering, "He tells people you wouldn't make it alone, that you're emotionally fragile, that you'd come crawling back if he ever left." The plate slipped slightly in my wet hands. I tightened my grip before it shattered, and suddenly, every strange look from neighbors, every patronizing comment, every subtle expression of pity over the past few years finally made sense. Daniel hadn't just humiliated me privately. He had been building a story about me publicly. A helpless wife. A dependent woman. Someone incapable of surviving without him. Melissa touched my arm gently. I'm sure he didn't mean it the way it sounds, but I barely heard her. Because in that moment, standing in my kitchen with dishwater cooling around my fingers, I realized something terrifying. Daniel wasn't afraid of losing me. He was certain I could never leave. And maybe that certainty was about to become the biggest mistake of his life. I didn't sleep that night. Daniel fell asleep within minutes, snoring softly beside me like he hadn't just spent dinner dismantling my dignity piece by piece. I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. 34 years. I kept replaying that number in my head. 34 years of marriage. 34 years of compromise. 34 years of making excuses for a man who had slowly convinced me I was nothing without him. And somehow, the most painful part wasn't the insult itself. It was how believable he'd made it sound. By 3 a.m, I quietly slipped out of bed and walked downstairs. The house felt enormous at night. Cold. I stood in the kitchen where so much of my life had happened. Birthday cakes, Christmas dinners, science fair projects, late-night talks with Ethan after heartbreaks. I had poured myself into this house until there was barely anything left of me, and yet somehow, none of it belonged to me. That realization settled into my chest like a stone. I made coffee, even though my stomach felt sick. Then I opened the drawer beside the refrigerator and pulled out the bank statement again. $300,000. Hidden, secret, separate. I stared at the numbers until my vision blurred. Daniel always insisted we needed to be careful financially. He complained about expenses constantly. He questioned every purchase I made. Meanwhile, he had quietly built a private financial life behind my back. A strange calm came over me then. Not rage, not panic, clarity. For the first time in years, I stopped worrying about protecting Daniel's feelings. By 9 that morning, after Daniel left for work, I sat in my car outside a brick office building downtown, with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles hurt. The gold sign beside the entrance read, Linda Hayes, Family Law Attorney. I almost drove away twice. Women my age aren't supposed to start over. That's what society teaches us. You survive. You tolerate. You shrink yourself quietly until life ends. But another voice inside me whispered something I hadn't felt in years. What if there's still time? The receptionist greeted me kindly and handed me paperwork. Even writing my own name felt strange. Tara Robertson. Married, housewife. No independent income. The words looked pathetic on paper. When Linda Hayes finally called me into her office, I nearly burst into tears before I even sat down. She looked to be in her late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed absolutely nothing. What can I help you with today, Mrs. Robertson? I swallowed hard. My husband wants a divorce, I said softly. The words sounded unreal out loud. Linda nodded gently. Do you want one too? That question stunned me, because honestly, I hadn't allowed myself to think about what I wanted in years. I don't know, I admitted, but I think my husband has been hiding money from me. That got her attention immediately. I handed her the bank statement. Linda adjusted her glasses and read silently for a moment. Then her expression changed. How long have you been married? 34 years? And this account is only in his name? Yes. Do you have access to all marital financial records? I almost laughed. No. The more questions she asked, the more embarrassed I became. Did I know all his retirement accounts? No. Did I know every investment? No. Did I have passwords to shared financial portals? No. Was my name on all properties? I hesitated. I'm not sure. Linda leaned back slowly. Tara, I need you to understand something clearly. Her voice softened. Being a stay-at-home wife for decades does not make you powerless. I stared at her. Because no one had said anything remotely like that to me in years. You contributed to this marriage, she continued firmly, legally and financially. Courts recognize unpaid labor inside a marriage. My throat tightened unexpectedly. I didn't realize how badly I needed someone to say that. Linda began explaining things carefully. Marital assets, hidden accounts, financial disclosures, legal protections. Most of it blurred together because my mind kept circling one terrifying thought: Daniel had built our entire marriage around keeping me dependent. Before I left, Linda gave me a list. Gather tax returns, retirement documents, property records, bank statements, insurance information. Do not confront him yet, she warned. People hiding money often become unpredictable when they realize they're being exposed. The drive home felt surreal. For the first time in decades, I wasn't simply reacting to Daniel's behavior. I was preparing. That changed something inside me. Over the next 2 weeks, I became someone my husband never imagined I could be. Observant, quiet, careful. Daniel barely noticed the difference because he'd spent so many years underestimating me. I started waking up early to photograph financial paperwork before he got up. I copied documents while he showered. I searched drawers, filing cabinets, old tax boxes in the basement. And what I found terrified me. There wasn't just one secret account. There were multiple transfers, large ones, thousands of dollars moved gradually over several years, always carefully, always hidden. One evening, I sat at the dining room table pretending to read while Daniel scrolled through his phone nearby. "You've been quiet lately," he said casually. "I'm tired." He smirked. "You're still upset about dinner I didn't answer." Daniel leaned back confidently. "Tara, you're overreacting. You've always been emotional." Emotional, that word. Men like Daniel loved that word because it transformed women's pain into weakness instead of evidence. He looked at me over his glasses. "You know divorce would destroy you financially, right?" There it was again. Not concern. A threat. I looked at him carefully. For the first time in years, I truly saw him. Not the young man from the bakery. Not Ethan's father. Not my husband. A man who genuinely believed fear would keep me obedient forever. "You seem very confident about that," I said quietly. He laughed. "Because it's true." Then he stood, kissed the top of my head like I was a child, and walked upstairs. I sat frozen in my chair long after he disappeared. That night, I went through his office again. I checked places I'd missed before. Desk drawers, cabinets, old folders. And tucked beneath a stack of insurance paperwork, I found something that made my blood run cold. Wire transfer confirmations, repeated transfers into the hidden account. Amounts large enough to matter. Some dated nearly 7 years back. But one transfer stood out immediately. $85,000. Transferred only 3 months earlier. The description line read, "Property liquidation." I frowned. We hadn't sold any property, at least, not that I knew of. My heart pounded as I dug deeper through the folder. Then I found it. A property deed. My hand started shaking so badly, I could barely hold the paper. Years ago, Daniel and I had jointly inherited a small parcel of land from his uncle outside Dayton. I remembered signing paperwork connected to it years earlier. Apparently, Daniel had sold it, without ever telling me. And somehow, the money had disappeared directly into his private account. I sat alone in that dark office, gripping the documents, while the truth finally became unavoidable. This wasn't just cruelty anymore. This wasn't just emotional manipulation. Daniel had been quietly building an escape plan behind my back for years. And suddenly, I understood something horrifying. My husband hadn't expected the marriage to last either. He had simply expected me to stay trapped long enough for him to leave comfortably. The strangest part about betrayal is that once the truth finally surfaces, your mind starts replaying your entire life differently. Suddenly, every memory changes shape. Every excuse sounds foolish. Every warning sign becomes obvious. For days after finding the property documents, I moved through the house like a ghost. I cooked dinner, folded laundry, watered the plants near the kitchen window, and all the while I kept thinking the same thing. Daniel had been preparing for life without me for years. While I had spent decades protecting our marriage, he had quietly been protecting himself from it. Oddly enough, that realization didn't destroy me the way I expected. It woke me up. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I found myself standing in the attic searching through old storage boxes. I wasn't even entirely sure what I was looking for. Maybe proof that I used to exist before becoming Daniel Robertson's wife. The attic smelled like dust and cardboard and old winters. Rain tapped softly against the roof while I opened box after box, filled with forgotten pieces of my life. Ethan's kindergarten drawings, Christmas decorations, photo albums. Then I found a small floral tin tucked beneath an old blanket. My chest tightened immediately because I recognized it. I hadn't seen that tin in over 20 years. Slowly, I opened it. Inside were recipe cards, dozens of them. My recipe cards, handwritten in faded blue ink, blueberry streusel muffins, brown butter pecan cookies, cinnamon swirl bread, apple crumb pie. My fingers trembled as I touched them. Before I became a wife, before I became someone's mother, I had once been Tara Mitchell, the girl who dreamed about opening a bakery, the girl who used to stay up until 2 a.m. testing frosting recipes because baking made her feel alive. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor while memories came rushing back so hard it almost hurt. Back then, people used to line up outside the bakery where I worked just to buy my cinnamon rolls on Saturdays. "Your hands are magic," my old manager used to tell me. Daniel loved bragging about my baking when we first met. "You're gonna own your own place someday," he used to say proudly. God, I had forgotten he once believed in me. Or maybe he only loved me when my dreams still revolved around him. At the bottom of the tin beneath the recipe cards, I found something else. A folded letter. My mother's handwriting covered the envelope. For Tara. My breath caught. My mother had passed away almost 15 years earlier, after a long battle with ovarian cancer. Losing her felt like losing the last person who truly saw me clearly. I carefully unfolded the letter. "Tara, if you're reading this, then maybe you're finally remembering who you are." Tears burned instantly behind my eyes. "Your grandmother used to say women in our family survive everything, not because life is easy for us, but because we learn how to rebuild." I pressed a hand against my mouth. "You were always the brave one. Don't let marriage make you forget that." Inside the envelope was another paper, a bank document. I frowned in confusion. Then I saw the account information. My mother had left me money, not a fortune, but enough to matter. Nearly $40,000 sitting untouched in a trust account I had completely forgotten existed. I stared at the number in disbelief. Daniel never mentioned this. Not once. A sick feeling crept through me. Had he known? My mother had trusted Daniel completely while she was sick. He helped organize paperwork near the end of her life. Suddenly, I wondered how many things had quietly disappeared inside my marriage without me noticing. I sat there crying for almost an hour. Not because of the money. Because for the first time in years I felt connected to the woman I used to be before life shrank me into someone smaller. That evening, after Daniel left for a business dinner, I drove across town to a small cafe near the river. Claire Bennett owned the place. We hadn't spoken in nearly 8 years. Not because we fought. Life just drifted. Or maybe Daniel slowly isolated me from anyone who reminded me of myself before him. Claire looked up from behind the counter when I entered. For a second, she stared blankly. Then her face changed completely. "Tara." I almost burst into tears right there. Claire hurried around the counter and hugged me tightly. "Oh my God, look at you." Something about being held without judgment nearly broke me apart. We sat in a booth near the back, while rain slid down the cafe windows outside. Claire studied me carefully. "You look exhausted," she said gently. I laughed weakly. That obvious yes. For a while we talked about harmless things. Health, aging parents, Ohio winters. Then finally, Claire leaned forward. "What's really going on?" And just like that, everything spilled out. The hidden accounts, the humiliation, the divorce, Daniel's comments, the years of feeling invisible. Claire listened quietly without interrupting once. When I finished, I stared down at my untouched coffee, embarrassed by how pathetic my life sounded out loud. But Claire surprised me. "You know what I remember most about you?" she asked. I frowned slightly. "What you used to walk into a kitchen like you owned it." I blinked. "You were fearless back then. You'd experiment with recipes constantly. Everybody talked about your baking. That was a lifetime ago." "No," Claire said firmly. "That was you." I looked away because I suddenly couldn't handle how badly I wanted to believe her. Claire stood abruptly. "Come with me." Confused, I followed her through the cafe into the kitchen area. Warm smells wrapped around me instantly. Butter, sugar, fresh bread. My chest tightened painfully. Claire crossed her arms. "My baker quit 3 weeks ago." I stared at her. "What, you heard me?" She pointed toward the empty prep station. "I need help." I laughed nervously. "Claire, I'm 62 years old, so I haven't worked professionally in decades, and I wouldn't even know where to start." Claire rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, please." Muscle memory doesn't disappear. Then she grabbed an apron from a hook and tossed it toward me. "Make something." I stared at the apron in my hands. For a moment, fear hit me so hard I nearly put it down. What if Daniel was right? What if I really had become useless? Claire softened her voice. "Tara, when's the last time you did something that belonged only to you?" I couldn't answer, because I honestly didn't remember. Slowly, I tied the apron around my waist. The moment my fingers touched the flour bins and mixing bowls, something strange happened inside me. My body remembered before my mind did. Measurements, textures, timing. I moved automatically, almost instinctively. Claire watched silently while I prepared cinnamon roll dough from memory. At one point, she smiled quietly. "There she is." I pretended not to understand what she meant, but deep inside, I did. An hour later, the kitchen filled with the warm scent of cinnamon and butter. Claire tore off a piece of one roll while it was still hot. The moment she tasted it, her eyes widened. "Oh my God!" I laughed nervously. "It's probably not that good." Claire stared at me like I was insane. "Tara, this is incredible." I felt something that I hadn't felt in years. Pride. Real pride. Not for being a good wife, not for keeping everyone else comfortable, for myself. Claire immediately grabbed her phone. "What are you doing?" I asked. She ignored me. Then she looked up and smiled. "How would you feel about selling pastries here on weekends?" Fear rushed through me instantly. Fear. And something dangerously close to hope. The first night I slept alone after leaving Daniel felt unbearably quiet. Not peaceful, not freeing, just quiet in the kind of way that forces you to hear every fear you've spent years avoiding. My new apartment sat above a hardware store on the edge of Columbus. The building was old, the carpet smelled faintly like dust, and the radiator clanged every few hours like it was protesting its own existence. But it was mine. That thought both comforted and terrified me. The divorce process had moved faster once Linda Hayes uncovered Daniel's hidden accounts and questionable financial transfers. Suddenly, his confidence shifted. He stopped acting smug and started acting irritated, cold, defensive, like I had become inconvenient. He barely looked at me during the final weeks inside the house. One morning, while I packed dishes into cardboard boxes, Daniel stood in the doorway, watching silently. "You're really doing this," he said flatly. I kept wrapping plates in newspaper. Yes. He shook his head slowly. Tara, you have no idea how expensive life is? I didn't answer. You're emotional right now. That's all this is. Still, I said nothing. That seemed to bother him more than arguing ever had. You'll come back, he muttered eventually. Then he walked away. At the time, part of me still feared he might be right. The apartment looked painfully empty after decades inside a family home. I had a small couch, a folding table, 2 lamps and boxes stacked against the walls. The silence hit hardest at night. No television in the background. No footsteps upstairs. No routine. For 34 years, my life had revolved around taking care of other people. Without that structure, I felt strangely untethered. The second night alone, I sat on the kitchen floor eating grocery store soup straight from the container because I hadn't unpacked bowls yet. And for the first time since the divorce began, I cried, really cried. Not polite tears, not silent tears, the kind that leave your chest aching afterward. I cried for my younger self, for wasted years, for all the times I apologized just to keep peace, for all the moments I abandoned myself little by little until I barely recognized the woman staring back in the mirror. Most of all, I cried because I was terrified Daniel had been right about me. What if I couldn't survive alone? At 62 years old, fear feels different than it does when you're young. When you're young, failure feels temporary. At my age, it feels final. The next morning, Claire called before 8. You're coming to the cafe. I laughed weakly. That wasn't a question, was it? Nope. I don't know if I'm ready. Tara, she said firmly. If you sit alone in that apartment too long, your fear's gonna start sounding like truth. That sentence stayed with me. An hour later, I stood inside Claire's kitchen, tying on an apron while anxiety churned in my stomach. The cafe was small but warm, with exposed brick walls and mismatched wooden tables that made the place feel welcoming instead of trendy. Claire's regular customers were mostly teachers, retirees, and local office workers. Real people. Kind people. Still, my hands shook while measuring flour. Claire noticed immediately. You're nervous. I haven't done this professionally in decades. You've baked your whole life. That's different. No, she said softly. It isn't. The first weekend we sold my pastries, I barely slept beforehand. I woke at 4 in the morning to begin baking. Cinnamon rolls, lemon loaf cake, blueberry muffins, apple turnovers. By 7, the tiny kitchen smelled like butter and sugar and cinnamon so strongly, it wrapped around me like a memory. For a few beautiful moments, I forgot about divorce entirely. I forgot about Daniel. I forgot about fear. Then customers arrived. And suddenly, all the insecurity came crashing back. What if nobody bought anything? What if Claire realized she'd made a mistake? What if Daniel was right, and this was all pathetic? A woman around my age approached the pastry case first. Oh my goodness, she said. Did Claire hire a new baker? Claire pointed toward me proudly. Tara made all of it. The woman smiled warmly. Well, Tara's talented. Something inside me softened slightly. She bought 2 cinnamon rolls and a lemon loaf. Then another customer purchased muffins. Then another ordered turnovers. Not huge amounts, nothing dramatic, but enough to make me breathe easier. Until around noon, that's when business slowed completely. The lunch rush passed. The pastry shelves still looked too full. I watched customers walk by the cafe window without coming inside, and every ounce of confidence I'd built that morning began collapsing. This was stupid, I muttered quietly while wiping counters. Claire looked up from the register. What was all of this? Tara, I'm too old to start over. There it is, Claire said calmly. I frowned. What Daniel's voice? I looked away immediately because she was right. Claire walked closer. You've spent so many years hearing that man tell you who you are that now you repeat it to yourself. I swallowed hard. That doesn't mean he's wrong. Claire stared at me for a long moment. Then she pointed toward the nearly empty tray of cinnamon rolls. Those sold out in 3 hours. So stop acting like failure because life feels unfamiliar. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But fear is stubborn after decades of emotional erosion. That afternoon, after closing, Claire handed me an envelope. What's this your share from today? I opened it carefully. $342. My eyes widened instantly. You're kidding. You earned it. I stared at the cash in disbelief. $300 might not sound life-changing to some people, but to me, it felt monumental. Because for the first time in over 30 years, I had earned money that belonged entirely to me. Not household money. Not Daniel's money. Mine. That night, I sat alone in my tiny apartment staring at the envelope on the kitchen table. Then, something unexpected happened. I smiled. A real smile. Small. Fragile. But real. The following weeks became a blur of exhaustion and anxiety. I rented time inside a community kitchen during off hours because Claire's cafe kitchen was too small for larger batches. The first time I walked into the industrial kitchen, I felt wildly out of place among younger food entrepreneurs, carrying tablets and wearing branded hoodies. Meanwhile, I looked like someone's nervous aunt borrowing space she didn't deserve. Still, I kept showing up. Every morning before sunrise, every evening after cleanup, my body ached constantly. My feet hurt. I ruined several batches adjusting recipes for larger ovens, but slowly, customers returned asking for specific items. The cinnamon rolls from last week. Are there more pecan cookies today? Did Tara make the apple cake again? Hearing my own name attached to something people enjoyed stirred something alive inside me. Not because of praise, because I finally felt visible again. One Friday afternoon, while packing pastry boxes into my car outside the community kitchen, my phone buzzed. Daniel. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. What? He sounded irritated immediately. Ethan said, "You're working now." The way he said working made it sound ridiculous. "I'm baking." He laughed softly. "For money?" "Yes." Another laugh. Meaner this time. "Tara, come on. This little hobby isn't going to support you." I gripped the phone tighter. "I'm managing. You're surviving off divorce settlements and temporary excitement?" His voice lowered smugly. "Reality's coming." I closed my eyes. For years, conversations like this would have shattered me. But suddenly, something strange happened. Instead of hearing authority in his voice, I heard fear. Tiny. Hidden. But there. "You sound worried," I said quietly. Silence. Then Daniel scoffed. "I'm not worried about anything." But before hanging up, he added one sentence that lingered with me long afterward. "Don't embarrass yourself, Tara." That night, lying in bed inside my tiny apartment, I stared at the ceiling and realized something important. Daniel didn't just want me dependent. He needed me doubtful. Because the moment I started believing in myself again, his version of me stopped existing. The Saturday Daniel showed up at the farmer's market started like any other cold October morning in Columbus. I woke before dawn, tied my hair back, and stood inside the community kitchen, frosting cinnamon rolls while soft country music played from someone's old radio in the corner. For the first time in months, I felt almost peaceful. Not happy exactly, but steady. There's a difference. Steady means the panic no longer owns every minute of your day. By 8:30, I had loaded trays of pastries into my car and driven downtown to the Riverside Market, where local vendors gathered every weekend. The air smelled like roasted coffee and fallen leaves. People wandered between booths carrying tote bags and warm drinks, while acoustic music drifted from a nearby corner stage. Claire helped me arrange everything neatly. Apple crumb cakes in the center, pecan bars to the left, cinnamon rolls near the register because people always bought those first once they smelled them. Claire stepped back and smiled. "Looks beautiful." I straightened a handwritten sign nervously. Tara's Homemade Bakery. The name still felt temporary somehow, like I hadn't earned it yet. Customers began arriving slowly. An older man bought banana bread for his wife. A young mother purchased muffins for her kids. One woman told me my peach cobbler reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen, and I nearly cried right there behind the table. Little by little, the fear inside me loosened. Then around noon, I saw the black Mercedes. My stomach dropped instantly. Daniel parked along the curb near the market entrance. Even from a distance, I recognized the arrogant way he walked, like the world naturally made space for him. For one foolish second, I wondered if maybe he'd come to apologize. Then I remembered who he was. Claire saw him too. Oh no. Daniel approached slowly, wearing an expensive camel coat and sunglasses, despite the cloudy weather. He glanced around at the market booths with obvious judgment before finally stopping in front of my table. "Well," he said loudly, "look at this." Several nearby customers turned toward us immediately. I forced myself to stay calm. "What are you doing here?" Daniel ignored the question. He picked up a cookie, inspecting it like he was evaluating something cheap at a garage sale. "This is what you're doing now." Claire crossed her arms. "She's working Daniel." He smirked. "Cute little hobby." I felt heat rise into my face instantly. "It's not a hobby." "Oh, please," he said dismissively. "You're selling cookies at a flea market. Farmer's market, not flea market." But humiliation never cares about accuracy. A young couple browsing nearby exchanged uncomfortable looks. I quietly set down the pastry box I'd been holding. "You should leave." Daniel leaned closer across the table. "No, Tara. You need to hear this." There it was, that tone, the one he used whenever he wanted to shrink me publicly. "You're embarrassing yourself." My chest tightened painfully. Claire stepped forward immediately. "That's enough." But Daniel wasn't finished. "You had a beautiful house, financial security, stability." He gestured dramatically around the market. "And now you're standing outside in the cold, begging strangers to buy muffins." A few customers nearby looked horrified. One older woman slowly put back the pastry she'd been holding and quietly walked away, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. Humiliation flooded through me so fast it made my hands shake. Part of me wanted to disappear. Part of me wanted to scream. Instead, I heard myself say quietly, "I'm not begging anyone." Daniel laughed. "Come on, Tara. We both know this little fantasy won't last." Fantasy. That word hit hard, because deep down, fear still whispered the same thing to me every night. What if this all collapsed? What if I failed publicly? Daniel lowered his voice slightly, though not enough to keep others from hearing. "You couldn't survive 30 days without my money." I swallowed hard. "You don't know that anymore." His expression darkened immediately. For a second, I saw genuine anger flicker behind his eyes. Not because I'd insulted him, because I'd contradicted him. Claire stepped between us. You need to go. Daniel ignored her completely. You know what your problem is, Tara, he said coldly. You spent too much time listening to people fill your head with nonsense. He glanced toward Claire. She's giving you false hope. I noticed several nearby vendors openly staring now. The humiliation felt unbearable. But underneath it, something else stirred. Because suddenly I realized Daniel hadn't come here to laugh at me. He came because my independence bothered him. Deeply. He wouldn't have driven across town for a woman he truly considered powerless. You done? I asked quietly. Daniel blinked. What I said, are you done humiliating me in public today? For the first time since arriving, he looked genuinely thrown off balance. Then he scoffed loudly. I'm trying to save you from making a fool of yourself. No, I said softly. You're trying to make sure I still feel afraid of you. The silence around us became immediate and heavy. Daniel's jaw tightened. Claire looked at me in surprise, and for one brief moment, I saw uncertainty flicker across Daniel's face. It vanished quickly. You always were dramatic, he muttered. Then he tossed the untouched cookie back onto the tray carelessly and turned away. As he walked off, I noticed something strange. Ethan stood near the far edge of the market parking lot beside his truck, watching. He had been there the entire time. Our eyes met briefly, and instead of walking toward me, he followed his father. That hurt more than Daniel's cruelty ever could. The rest of the afternoon became a blur. Customers still came, but I struggled to focus. My hands trembled while boxing pastries. Every time someone looked at me kindly, I felt humiliation burn hotter. Claire stayed beside me quietly. Around 3, she touched my arm gently. You okay? I laughed shakily. No. She nodded like she expected that answer. You didn't deserve that. I stared down at the table. But what if he's right? Claire's expression hardened instantly. Tara. What if I really am making a fool of myself? Claire grabbed my shoulders firmly. Look around. I glanced up. Half the pastries were sold. 3 customers stood waiting near the register. A little girl smiled excitedly while holding one of my cinnamon rolls with both hands. That man spent decades convincing you that your worth depended on his approval, Claire said quietly. But the rest of the world doesn't see you through his eyes. I wanted to believe her. I truly did. But shame is hard to unlearn. Especially public shame. That evening, exhausted and emotionally drained, I returned home carrying empty trays into my apartment building. My phone buzzed just as I reached my door. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. Hello? A woman's voice responded carefully. Hi. Is this Tara from the farmer's market? Yes. I just wanted to say, I saw what happened today. My stomach sank instantly. Oh. The woman continued quickly. I recorded part of it because honestly, your ex-husband was being cruel. I froze. I posted it online after I got home. My heart started pounding. Oh no. No, listen, she interrupted gently. People are supporting you. I leaned against the apartment wall in confusion. What do you mean it's getting shared a lot locally? Fear rushed through me immediately. The last thing I wanted was public attention, especially pity. I didn't call to upset you, the woman said kindly. I just wanted you to know. The way you handled yourself today was graceful. Graceful? No one had used that word to describe me in years. After we hung up, I stood alone in my apartment staring at my phone. Then slowly, hesitantly, I opened social media. And there it was, a shaky video clip from the market. Daniel mocking me, belittling me, laughing at my work. But the comments underneath stunned me. Her pastries are amazing. That man is emotionally abusive. She deserves better. Supporting this bakery immediately. This woman handled herself with so much dignity. I sank slowly onto the couch while tears filled my eyes. For years, Daniel made me believe people would see me as weak without him. But strangers were seeing strength in me I couldn't even recognize in myself yet. And somewhere deep inside, beneath all the fear and humiliation, something began changing. For the first time in decades, I stopped seeing survival as impossible. I woke up the next morning expecting humiliation. Instead, I found 12 new orders sitting in my inbox. At first, I honestly thought there had been some mistake. I sat at my tiny kitchen table, wearing an old sweatshirt, staring at my laptop, while the coffee beside me went cold. 2 dozen cinnamon rolls, 3 peach cobblers, custom birthday cupcakes, corporate pastry tray inquiry. I blinked repeatedly. Then another email notification appeared, and another, and another. My phone buzzed beside the laptop nonstop, with messages from people asking where they could buy my pastries. By noon, Claire called me laughing. "Please tell me you've checked your phone. I think something's wrong." Claire burst out laughing louder. "Tara, nothing's wrong. Your video exploded." I pressed a hand against my forehead. "This is insane." "No," Claire corrected gently. "This is people recognizing cruelty when they see it." The video from the farmer's market had spread far beyond our local neighborhood overnight. Someone reposted it to a larger Columbus community page, and from there, it traveled quickly. The comments kept growing. Thousands of them. Most weren't even talking about the pastries anymore. They were talking about him, about Daniel, about the way he spoke to me. Women shared stories about ex-husbands who mocked them. Men apologized in comments for not realizing emotional abuse could look so subtle and ordinary. One comment hit me especially hard. "She stood there calmer than I would have. That woman's stronger than she knows." I read that sentence at least 10 times, because strength had never felt the way I imagined it would. Strength, I was learning, wasn't loud. It wasn't fearless. Sometimes strength was simply refusing to disappear. By the end of the week, I had more orders than I could physically manage alone. I stood inside the community kitchen at 6 in the morning, staring at stacks of order forms spread across the stainless steel counter, while panic rose steadily in my chest. "This is too much," I muttered. Claire sipped coffee nearby. "That's generally what success looks like at first." "I can't fill all these?" "You can." "No, seriously. I physically cannot." Claire grinned slightly. "Then maybe it's time to stop thinking like someone trying to survive?" I frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means maybe you should start thinking like someone building something." That sentence lingered in my mind the entire day. Building something. Not surviving, not escaping. Building. The idea felt almost too big to touch. That afternoon, Claire introduced me to 2 women she knew from church who were looking for part-time work. Janice was 68 and recently widowed. Denise was a retired school cafeteria worker helping support her granddaughter. Both women looked nervous walking into the kitchen. And suddenly, for the first time, I realized something surprising. I wasn't the only older woman starting over. We all carried the same exhaustion in our eyes, the same fear of becoming invisible. By the end of the shift, flour covered half the kitchen. Denise accidentally dropped an entire tray of cookies, and Janice kept forgetting where Claire stored mixing bowls. And somehow, I laughed harder than I had in years. Real laughter. Not polite laughter. Not survival laughter. The kind that loosens something tight inside your chest. That night, I sat alone in my apartment reviewing numbers carefully. Orders, ingredient costs, packaging expenses, projected income, For the first time in decades, I wasn't asking Daniel for permission to make financial decisions. I was making them myself. The realization felt strangely emotional. A week later, Claire surprised me by unveiling a new sign near the cafe register. Second Rise Bakery, by Tara Robertson. I stared at it, speechless. Claire. She shrugged casually. Fits the story, but it wasn't just the story. It fit me, because for the first time in years, I truly felt like I was rising again from something broken. Business kept growing after that. A local morning radio host mentioned the farmer's market video and invited listeners to support the bakery lady who handled her ex-husband with class. The next Saturday, the line at our booth stretched halfway down the sidewalk. I nearly cried when I saw it. People smiled at me warmly. Customers asked for photos. One older woman hugged me unexpectedly and whispered, "You gave me courage to leave too." That shook me deeply, because I still didn't fully understand what people were seeing in me. I still felt terrified most days. Still doubted myself constantly. Still woke up some mornings convinced everything would collapse. But maybe courage isn't about certainty. Maybe courage is continuing while uncertain. Around noon, while we scrambled to refill pastry trays, Claire nudged my shoulder. "Don't look obvious," she whispered. "What, there's a woman over there who's been watching you for 20 minutes. I glanced discreetly toward a nearby bench. An elegant older woman sat there wearing a cream wool coat and dark sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. She looked wealthy in a quiet, understated way. Not flashy, powerful. She noticed me looking and smiled slightly. "Do you know her?" I whispered. Claire shook her head. The woman eventually approached the booth after most customers cleared. "Are you Tara Robertson?" "Yes." She extended a hand. "Naomi Walker." Something about her confidence immediately made me straighten my posture unconsciously. "It's nice to meet you. I've heard quite a lot about you this week." I laughed nervously. Hopefully not all bad. "Actually," Naomi said calmly, quite the opposite. She purchased several pastries before glancing around the crowded market. "You built all this from scratch, I guess so." "No," she said firmly. "Not guess. You did." There was something direct about her that unsettled me slightly. Naomi took a bite of one of the cinnamon rolls and closed her eyes briefly. "Well," she murmured, "that explains the line." I laughed softly. Then Naomi surprised me. "Have you ever considered opening a permanent location?" I nearly choked. "Oh no, this is already overwhelming enough." Overwhelming and impossible are not the same thing. I stared at her uncertainly. She reached into her purse and handed me a business card. Naomi Walker, Hospitality Group. Even I recognized the name immediately. Walker Hospitality owned several upscale restaurants and boutique hotels throughout Ohio. My stomach tightened. "I don't understand." Naomi smiled gently. "I invest in women sometimes." "Why?" Her expression shifted slightly. "Because 30 years ago, someone invested in me when nobody else took me seriously." The market noise around us suddenly felt distant. Naomi studied me carefully. "You have something people connect to, Tara. Not just the pastries. I'm just trying to survive." "No," she said quietly. "You're building a brand rooted in emotional truth. People feel that." Brand. The word sounded absurd, connected to me. Before leaving, Naomi paused. "When you're ready to think bigger, call me." Then she walked away into the crowd. I stood frozen, holding the business card long after she disappeared. Claire hurried over immediately. "Who was that?" I handed her the card. Her eyes widened instantly. "Oh my God, what, Tara? Naomi Walker is kind of a huge deal." I laughed nervously again. She probably says things like that to everyone. Claire stared at me like I'd lost my mind. No, she absolutely does not. That evening, exhausted after another sold-out market day, I returned home carrying empty trays and aching feet. As I unlocked my apartment door, I noticed a familiar black Mercedes parked across the street. Daniel sat inside, watching. The moment he realized I saw him, he looked away quickly. But not before I caught the expression on his face. Not arrogance, not amusement, confusion, concern, maybe even fear. And suddenly, I understood something important. Daniel expected me to fail publicly, what he never prepared for. Was the possibility that people might believe in me more than I ever believed in myself. Success has a strange way of exposing people. Some become kinder when they see you rising. Others become desperate. Daniel became desperate. At first, it showed up in small ways. More phone calls, longer text messages, questions disguised as concern. Are you managing okay financially? You shouldn't trust strangers too quickly. This attention online won't last forever. Every message carried the same hidden meaning. Come back before reality crushes you. But reality wasn't crushing me anymore. Reality was finally showing me who he truly was. 3 days after, I noticed Daniel watching my apartment from across the street. Linda Hayes called, asking me to come into her office immediately. Her tone alone made my stomach tighten. When I arrived, Linda already had several folders spread across her desk. "You okay?" I asked nervously. She removed her glasses slowly. "That depends on how much honesty you're prepared for today." My chest tightened instantly. Linda slid a stack of documents toward me. We subpoenaed additional financial records. I stared down at the paperwork, without fully understanding what I was looking at. Transfer statements, property records, bank movements. Linda pointed carefully at highlighted sections. "These transfers began almost 8 years ago." I swallowed hard. "That long, yes." She hesitated before continuing. "Tara, your husband wasn't just hiding money." A cold feeling crept through my chest. "He was systematically moving marital assets into accounts designed to limit your access during divorce proceedings." The room suddenly felt too warm. I stared at her blankly. "You mean he planned this?" Linda gave me a look that answered before she spoke. "I think Daniel anticipated ending the marriage long before you realized there was one ending." That sentence landed like a physical blow. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe properly. 34 years? And somewhere during those years, my husband quietly began preparing for life after me, while still sleeping beside me every night. How much I whispered. Linda folded her hands carefully. "Based on what we've uncovered so far, potentially several $100,000. I stared at her in disbelief. But how could he do that without me knowing? Linda's expression softened. "Because he controlled the financial structure of your marriage." Shame flooded me instantly. I hated how naive I suddenly felt. Linda continued gently. "This happens more often than you think, especially when one's spouse has handled finances exclusively for decades." I looked down at the papers again. Then one specific signature caught my eye. My signature. Except, not mine. I frowned immediately. "What is this?" Linda slid the paper closer. "A refinancing authorization tied to the Dayton property sale." My stomach dropped. "I never signed this." "I know." I looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" Linda exhaled slowly. "Tara, I had a handwriting specialist review several documents." The room went completely silent. And then she said the words that changed everything. "We believe Daniel forged your signature multiple times." I physically recoiled backward in the chair. "No, I'm sorry." "No," I repeated shakily. "Daniel wouldn't." But even as I said it, I remembered. The rushed paperwork. The times he told me just sign here. The documents he handled without explanation. The years I trusted him blindly. Linda opened another folder. These signatures don't match verified samples from your legal records. I stared at the papers while my hands started trembling uncontrollably. It's strange how betrayal evolves. At first it hurts emotionally, then eventually it becomes something darker. You begin questioning your own memories, your own judgment, your entire understanding of the life you lived. I need some air, I whispered. Linda nodded sympathetically. I stood near the office window overlooking downtown Columbus while panic clawed its way up my throat. Daniel didn't just insult me, didn't just manipulate me. He stole from me, calculatedly, repeatedly, and somehow, the worst part still wasn't the money. It was realizing how little guilt he probably felt while doing it. Why, I asked quietly, without turning around. Linda answered honestly. Because he believed you'd never challenge him. That hurt, because it was true. For years I had chosen peace over confrontation, trust over suspicion, love over self-protection. And men like Daniel survive on women like that. When I finally left Linda's office hours later, I sat inside my car gripping the steering wheel while tears blurred my vision. Not weak tears. Angry ones. For the first time in my life, I wasn't mourning the marriage. I was mourning myself. The version of me who accepted crumbs while calling it loyalty. My phone buzzed suddenly. Ethan. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. Hi, Mom. His voice sounded hesitant. That alone was unusual. Hi. You busy? Not really. A pause. Then can we talk? We met at a small diner halfway between his office and my apartment. The moment I saw Ethan walking toward the booth, I felt a complicated ache inside my chest. He looked tired, older somehow, like the last few months had forced him to question things he never wanted to examine. He sat down awkwardly. You look good, he said quietly. It startled me because he sounded sincere. Thank you. A waitress took our order, and for several uncomfortable minutes, we discussed meaningless things. Weather, traffic, coffee. Finally, Ethan sighed heavily. Dad's been acting strange lately. I stirred cream into my coffee silently. How so? He's angry all the time. I almost laughed. That wasn't new. But I stayed quiet. Ethan rubbed his forehead. He keeps talking about your business. Business. The word still felt surreal attached to me. What about it? He says people manipulated you against him? There it was. Classic Daniel. If a woman gains confidence, someone else must have poisoned her mind. I looked at Ethan carefully. Do you believe that he hesitated too long? And honestly, that hurt. I don't know what to believe anymore, he admitted finally. At least that was honest. I nodded slowly. Then Ethan said something unexpected. Mom, did Dad really hide money from you? The question hung heavily between us. Part of me wanted to protect Ethan from the ugliness. Another part was tired of protecting everyone except myself. Yes. His face tightened immediately, and the forged signatures he asked quietly. I froze. How do you know about that? Ethan looked down. Melissa overheard Dad yelling on the phone with his lawyer. Cold dread settled into my stomach. So Daniel already knew Linda was investigating. That couldn't be good. Ethan looked miserable. I didn't know things were this bad. I studied my son carefully. You didn't want to know. The words slipped out before I could soften them. Ethan flinched, and immediately guilt stabbed through me because, despite everything, he was still my child. I'm sorry, I whispered. No, Ethan said quietly. You're right. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan leaned back heavily. You know what's messed up? What I grew up thinking Dad was strong? I swallowed hard. So did I. Ethan stared out the diner window. But now? He paused. Now I think he just needed everyone else to feel smaller. The sadness in his voice nearly broke my heart, because Daniel hadn't only damaged me, he had shaped our entire family around fear and control. Before leaving, Ethan hesitated beside the booth. Then he pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. I found this in Dad's office. My pulse quickened instantly. What is it? I think you should look. After he left, I slowly opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a printed email chain, dozens of messages between Daniel and a financial advisor. Most were routine, until I reached one message dated nearly 4 years earlier. I stopped breathing. The subject line read, Post-Divorce Asset Protection Strategy. My eyes scanned downward rapidly. She'll never understand the financial structure anyway. That sentence, written by my husband, about me, below it sat another message from the advisor. Are you certain she won't contest the settlement? Daniel's response came immediately. No. Tara's too emotionally dependent to leave. I stared at the words until my vision blurred. Not because they surprised me anymore, but because of how cold they were. How certain. Daniel didn't just underestimate me privately. He built entire plans around my weakness. Or at least, the weakness he believed I had. And suddenly, sitting alone in that diner booth with the email trembling in my hands, I realized something important. The greatest mistake Daniel Robertson ever made was assuming the woman he spent years silencing had nothing left inside her worth fighting for. For days after Ethan handed me the emails, I carried them around in my purse like they weighed 100 pounds. Not because I needed proof anymore. I already knew who Daniel was, but because every sentence confirmed something I had spent years trying not to believe. My husband never saw me as an equal partner. He saw me as manageable, predictable, dependent. And somehow, that realization changed the way I moved through the world. I stood straighter, spoke more directly, stopped apologizing for things that weren't my fault. Healing doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in tiny moments where fear slowly loses authority over your life. The bakery business kept growing faster than any of us expected. Every weekend, the line at our booth stretched longer. Claire eventually convinced me to start taking online pre-orders because we kept selling out before noon. Janice and Denise became permanent helpers. And for the first time in decades, I began waking up excited instead of anxious. Exhausted, yes. Terrified sometimes, absolutely. But alive. That frightened Daniel more than anything else ever had. He started calling constantly. Not screaming, not threatening. Worse, acting concerned. Tara, you're overworking yourself. Tara, those people are using you. Tara, you need to think realistically about your future. Every conversation carried the same hidden message, you still belong under my control. One evening, after a 14-hour baking day, I returned home to find Ethan sitting on the stairs outside my apartment building. At first, I barely recognized him because I wasn't expecting him there. He stood quickly when he saw me. Mom. My stomach tightened immediately. What happened? Nothing. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, tension in his shoulders. For a moment, he reminded me painfully of the little boy who used to wait awake for me after nightmares. I unlocked the apartment door quietly. Come in. The apartment still embarrassed me sometimes because it felt so small compared to the home Ethan grew up in. But for the first time, I noticed something surprising. Ethan looked around carefully, not judgmentally, almost thoughtfully. "It's nice," he said quietly. I gave a small laugh. "It's tiny. It feels peaceful." That caught me off guard. I set my purse down slowly. "What's going on?" Ethan rubbed his hands together nervously. Then finally, "Dad's lying." I stared at him. "I know." "No," Ethan said quickly. "I mean, worse than we thought." A cold feeling settled into my stomach. Ethan pulled his phone from his pocket and opened something. "I wasn't trying to snoop," he said. But Melissa showed me some emails. Immediately, my chest tightened. "What emails?" Ethan hesitated. Then he turned the screen toward me. The message thread was between Daniel and someone named Rachel. At first, I assumed it was work-related. Then I saw the dates. 3 years ago, 2 years ago, 18 months ago. The messages became increasingly personal. Dinner reservations, hotel confirmations, inside jokes. My stomach dropped. "Oh my God." Ethan looked miserable. "I think Dad's been seeing her for years." I sat down heavily at the kitchen table because suddenly my legs felt weak. An affair. Oddly enough, that wasn't even the most painful part. The most painful part was realizing I wasn't surprised. All those late nights, the secret accounts, the emotional distance. Some part of me must have known long before my mind allowed it. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered. I looked up at my son, and suddenly I saw how devastated he looked. Not defensive, not dismissive, heartbroken. "When did you find this morning?" I nodded slowly. Ethan sat across from me quietly. "I used to think you exaggerated things about Dad," he admitted softly. The honesty stung, but I appreciated it anyway. He always acted so confident, so certain. Ethan shook his head slowly. "I thought you were just unhappy." I swallowed hard. I was unhappy. "No." Ethan looked at me directly. "You were being emotionally destroyed." The words hung heavily between us, because hearing your child finally name your pain correctly after years of silence does something complicated to your heart. Part relief, part grief. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. "I should have seen it. You were raised inside it," I said quietly. "That changes what feels normal." He looked down immediately because he knew I was right. Children learn love by watching their parents, and Ethan learned that marriage meant one person shrinking while the other expanded. "I keep replaying things now," he admitted. "Comments Dad made. The way he talked to you." His voice cracked slightly. "And I laughed sometimes." "Oh, that hurt." Not because it was new, because he finally understood it. I reached across the table instinctively and squeezed his hand. "You were a child, but I'm not anymore." Silence settled between us. Then Ethan said quietly, "Melissa's upset too." I frowned slightly. I thought she agreed with him most of the time. Ethan gave a sad laugh. "She was scared of him." That surprised me. "What do you mean he judged everything? Clothes, parenting, money?" Ethan shook his head. "You know what he told Melissa once?" I waited quietly. He said women get emotional when they don't understand finances. I almost laughed from disbelief because it sounded exactly like Daniel. "He treated you both the same," I realized softly. "Pretty much." Something about that realization broke my heart in an entirely new way. Control rarely stops with one target. Eventually, it poisons every relationship around it. Ethan looked around my apartment again. Then his eyes landed on stacks of bakery boxes near the counter. "You really built all this yourself?" The question sounded genuine, not mocking, not doubtful. I looked at the boxes quietly. "I guess I did." A small smile appeared on Ethan's face. You know, people at my office are obsessed with your cinnamon rolls now. I blinked in surprise. What one woman drove 40 minutes to buy them? I laughed softly despite myself. That's ridiculous. No, Ethan said quietly. It's impressive. That word nearly undid me, because I couldn't remember the last time my son looked at me with admiration instead of pity. Then his expression darkened again. There's something else. My stomach tightened instantly. What, Dad's panicking? I frowned. What do you mean he keeps making calls about money? He's angry all the time. Ethan hesitated. And I heard him talking to someone about legal exposure. Legal exposure. My pulse quickened. He knows Linda found something. I think he's scared. The word hung between us strangely. Daniel scared that man spent decades acting untouchable. But suddenly, I remembered the expression on his face watching me at the market. Fear. Tiny. Hidden. But real. Ethan looked directly at me. I don't think Dad expected you to fight back. Fight back. Another phrase that felt strange connected to me. Because for most of my life, I avoided conflict at all costs. But maybe survival itself becomes a form of resistance when someone spends years convincing you that you're incapable of it. My phone buzzed suddenly on the table. Daniel. Of course. Ethan looked uncomfortable immediately. You gonna answer? I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then finally, I picked up. What Daniel's voice came sharp and irritated. Where's Ethan? I glanced toward my son. With me. A pause. Then, he needs to stop filling your head with nonsense. Something inside me snapped quietly at that sentence. Not explosively. Calmly. For years, Daniel framed every independent thought I had as manipulation from someone else. As if I couldn't possibly think for myself. No, I said evenly. He's telling me the truth. Silence. Then Daniel's tone hardened. You don't know what you're doing, Tara. And suddenly, for the first time in 34 years, I wasn't afraid of him. I leaned back slowly in my chair. No, I said softly. I think for the first time in my life, I finally do. Then I hung up. My hand trembled afterward, but not from fear, from adrenaline, from realization. Because healing isn't becoming fearless. Healing is realizing someone no longer has the power to define who you are. Ethan stared at me in shock. Then slowly, he smiled, and in that moment, I realized something beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. My son wasn't just watching me rebuild my life. He was watching a woman finally become visible after decades of disappearing. The first official Second Rise bakery storefront opened 6 months later on a snowy Friday morning in downtown Columbus. Sometimes, even now, I still struggle to believe that sentence is real. If someone had told me a year earlier that I'd be standing inside my own bakery at 62 years old wearing an apron with my name stitched across the front, while customers lined up outside the door, I would have laughed through tears. Not because I lacked talent, because I lacked belief in myself. That's what long-term emotional control steals first. Belief. The storefront itself wasn't huge, just a corner space with exposed brick walls, warm lighting, and wide front windows that fogged slightly during winter mornings from the heat of the ovens inside. But to me, it looked like freedom. The sign above the entrance read, Second Rise Bakery. Every time I looked at those words, my chest tightened emotionally. Because that bakery wasn't built from revenge. It was built from recovery. The morning of the grand opening, I arrived before sunrise while snow drifted softly outside beneath the streetlights. Janice was already there. So she said, tying on her apron, "You nervous?" I laughed shakily. I feel like I might throw up. Good, she replied. Means you care. Denise entered moments later, carrying coffee, and immediately started fussing with the pastry display trays. Claire arrived last, grinning like a proud older sister. And standing there watching these women bustle around the bakery, I felt something I hadn't expected. Community, not competition, not judgment. Support. Every woman inside that bakery had survived something. Janice lost her husband after 43 years and spent months terrified she couldn't survive alone financially. Denise raised 2 children while escaping an abusive marriage decades earlier. Claire rebuilt her cafe from bankruptcy after her first business partner disappeared with half the company's money. And me, I was rebuilding a self-worth Daniel spent years quietly dismantling. Naomi Walker had helped make the storefront possible, not through charity. That distinction mattered deeply to me. She invested because she believed the business could succeed. You have authenticity people trust, she told me during one of our meetings. I still wasn't entirely sure what that meant. But Naomi understood something before I did. People weren't only buying pastries. They were buying hope. The doors officially opened at 8. By 8:15, the line stretched onto the sidewalk. I stood frozen near the register, staring in disbelief, while customers filled the bakery with laughter, conversation, and the warm smell of cinnamon and coffee. One woman nearly cried after tasting the peach cobbler. An older man drove 2 hours because his granddaughter showed him the viral farmers market video months earlier. A group of nurses from a local hospital arrived carrying flowers. And every few minutes, someone told me some version of the same thing. You inspired me. I never knew how to respond to that. Because the truth was, most days I still felt scared. Healing doesn't magically erase fear. It just teaches you fear doesn't deserve control anymore. Around noon, local reporters arrived for a short interview Naomi had arranged. I nearly panicked. I can't do television? I whispered to Claire. Yes, you can. I'll sound ridiculous. Claire rolled her eyes. Tara, you survived divorce, humiliation, public shame, and starting over from nothing. You can survive a camera. Easy for her to say. Still, I sat nervously beneath studio lights while a smiling reporter adjusted her microphone. So, Tara, the woman asked warmly, what inspired Second Rise Bakery? For a second, I froze. Because how do you explain rebuilding your entire identity after decades of emotional erosion? I looked around the bakery. At Janice laughing with customers. At Denise carrying trays from the kitchen. At Claire proudly watching from behind the counter. Then finally, I answered honestly. I think some women spend so much time taking care of everyone else that eventually they forget they matter too. The room became quiet instantly. I swallowed hard. And sometimes life breaks your heart badly enough that you finally realize surviving isn't enough anymore. You want to live again. The reporter blinked rapidly. Behind the camera, Claire pressed both hands dramatically against her chest like she might cry. The interview aired that evening. By the next morning, business exploded again. Online orders tripled. Corporate catering inquiries flooded our website. A local magazine requested a feature story. Everything happened so fast, I barely had time to process it. And through all of it, Daniel grew increasingly unstable. At first, he just sent bitter texts. Enjoy your 15 minutes. You're letting strangers turn you against your family. Then the messages shifted tone entirely. Tara, maybe we should talk. I think we both made mistakes. I miss you. The first time I read one of those texts, I actually laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. After years of coldness, humiliation, manipulation, and betrayal, suddenly Daniel missed me once the world stopped agreeing with him. One evening after closing, I found him waiting outside the bakery. Snow covered the sidewalks while customers passed carrying pastry boxes and hot coffee. Daniel stood near the entrance with his hands in his coat pockets, looking older than I remembered. Tired. For a brief moment, seeing him like that stirred something painful in me. Because once upon a time, I loved this man deeply. "What are you doing here?" I asked quietly. He glanced around the bakery windows. "So this is really happening?" "It is." Daniel gave a short, humorless laugh. "I still can't believe all this came from some stupid internet video." I folded my arms against the cold. It came from years of work. His expression tightened slightly. "Tara." There it was again, that tone, the one that always expected me to soften. "I've been thinking a lot lately." I stayed silent. Daniel stepped closer. "Maybe we both handled things badly. Both." Interesting how accountability suddenly became shared once consequences appeared. "You forged my signature?" I said calmly. His face changed instantly. "I didn't come here to fight." "That's convenient." Daniel sighed heavily. "You're listening to lawyers too much." I stared at him in disbelief. "You stole from me? I protected assets." The coldness of that answer stunned even me. No remorse, no shame, just justification. Daniel looked toward the bakery again. "You know what I think," he said quietly. "I think all these people are filling your head with fantasies." Fantasy. That word again. Only this time, it no longer hurt. Because my reality now existed independently of his opinion. "I built this," I said softly. "You built it with money from the settlement?" "No," I corrected gently. "I built it after surviving you." For the first time in decades, Daniel had absolutely no response. None. He just stared at me while snow drifted quietly around us. And suddenly, I saw him clearly. Not powerful. Not intimidating. Just a man losing control of the narrative he built around himself. "You used to need me," he said finally. The sadness in his voice surprised me. And maybe that's what truly ended the last emotional hold he had over me. Because I finally understood something heartbreaking. Daniel didn't know how to love someone unless they depended on him. I looked at him quietly for a long moment. Then I answered honestly. "No," I said softly. I just believed I did. And for the first time since our marriage began falling apart, Daniel Robertson looked genuinely afraid of me. Not because I hated him, because I no longer needed his permission to become someone more. Success doesn't erase pain. It just changes the shape of it. By spring, Second Rise Bakery had become one of the busiest small bakeries in Columbus. We catered local events, partnered with coffee shops, and had lines out the door most weekends. People smiled when they recognized me now. Strangers waved. Customers brought flowers. Sometimes women quietly slipped handwritten notes into the tip jar, thanking me for telling the truth about starting over. And while all of that felt beautiful, there were still nights I sat alone in my apartment, wondering how my life had become unrecognizable so quickly. Some mornings I still woke up expecting Daniel beside me. Trauma doesn't disappear just because your circumstances improve. It lingers quietly in the body, in reflexes, in fear, in the instinct to apologize before speaking. But slowly, day by day, those instincts began loosening their grip. Then one Tuesday afternoon, Daniel walked into the bakery carrying a look I had never seen on his face before. Desperation. The lunch crowd had just faded. Janice was wiping tables while Denise boxed leftover muffins near the counter. The moment Daniel entered, the entire room seemed to tense. Even now, after everything, his presence still shifted the emotional temperature around me. He approached slowly. "Tara." I straightened from behind the register. "What do you want?" He glanced around awkwardly. Can we talk privately? No. His jaw tightened slightly. This doesn't need to be hostile. I almost laughed. No, Daniel. It didn't need to be hostile. But you made sure it always was. Claire emerged quietly from the kitchen, immediately sensing tension. Daniel noticed her and visibly irritated. Do you mind? He snapped. Claire crossed her arms. Very much, actually. I placed a hand gently on her arm. It's okay. Claire looked unconvinced, but stepped back. Daniel lowered his voice. I need help. The words stunned me so completely I thought I'd misheard him. What his eyes flickered away briefly. There were investment problems. Investment problems. Interesting phrase. Not mistakes. Not recklessness. Problems. How serious, Daniel exhaled heavily. I lost money. A cold realization settled slowly into my chest. How much he didn't answer immediately, which told me everything. Then finally, a lot. For several seconds, I simply stared at him. This was the same man who mocked me for spending $40 on a sweater. The same man who insisted I couldn't survive without him. The same man who secretly moved assets and forged my signature because he believed I was too weak to fight back. And now he stood in my bakery asking for help. The irony almost felt unreal. Daniel rubbed his forehead tiredly. The market shifted. Some deals collapsed. What kind of deals? Real estate investments. Suddenly, several pieces clicked together in my mind. The hidden money. The property liquidation. The panic Ethan mentioned. Daniel hadn't just hidden assets. He gambled with them. And apparently lost. How bad is it? I asked quietly. Daniel hesitated again. Then, finally, I may need to sell the house. The words hit me strangely, not because I wanted the house back, but because that house represented his greatest symbol of power for decades. And now, even that illusion was cracking. He stepped closer. Tara, we built a life together. There it was, the pivot, the emotional manipulation disguised as nostalgia. I looked at him carefully. No, I built a life around you. His expression hardened briefly. You know what I mean. Do I? Daniel sighed dramatically. I'm trying here. No, I said calmly. You're cornered. That silenced him immediately. For years I would have softened after seeing discomfort on his face. Now I simply saw a consequence. Daniel glanced around the bakery again. You're doing well. Yes, I'm proud of you. The sentence sounded so unnatural coming from him that it almost made me sad. Because if he had spoken to me this way years earlier, maybe none of this would have happened. But people who depend on your weakness rarely celebrate your strength until they need something from it. What exactly are you asking me for? I said quietly. He swallowed hard. I thought maybe we could work something out. My stomach turned instantly. There it was. Not apology, not accountability. Access. Daniel wanted access to my success, to my money, to the thing he once mocked openly. I stared at him in disbelief. You're asking me to financially support you? His face flushed immediately. That's not what I'm saying. It's exactly what you're saying. Daniel lowered his voice further. We were married 34 years, and during those years, you prepared financially to abandon me. That's not fair. I actually laughed softly at that. Fair. Interesting word from a man who forged signatures. Tara, he said carefully. I know I made mistakes. Mistakes? Again, with the soft language. Like emotional destruction and financial manipulation were accounting errors. You humiliated me publicly. Silence. You hid money from me? Silence. You cheated on me." That one visibly startled him. His eyes widened slightly. "You know about Rachel. Not even a question. Just realization." I nodded slowly. Daniel looked genuinely shaken for the first time since entering the bakery. It wasn't serious. The sentence hit me almost harder than the affair itself, because after decades together, that was his defense. Not serious. I stared at him quietly. "You know what's amazing?" I said softly. "You spent years convincing me I couldn't survive without you." Daniel's face tightened. "And now you're standing here asking the woman you called weak to save you?" The truth of that landed visibly. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel said something that revealed more than he intended. "I didn't think you'd change this much." There it was. The real problem. Not the divorce, not the bakery, not even the money. I had become someone he could no longer control. "You know what changed?" I asked quietly. Daniel remained silent. "I stopped seeing myself through your eyes." Something in his expression cracked then. Not dramatically, subtly. Like a man realizing his authority has disappeared completely. He looked older suddenly. Smaller. "I did love you," he said quietly. "And God help me." Part of me believed him, because emotional manipulators often do love you in the only broken way they understand love. But love without respect eventually becomes possession, and possession destroys everything it touches. I took a slow breath. "I loved you too." His eyes lifted hopefully for half a second. Then I continued. "But loving someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself so they can feel powerful." The hope vanished instantly. Daniel looked around the bakery one final time. At the customers, the staff, the warmth, the life I rebuilt without him. And I think that's when he finally understood something irreversible. I was never coming back. As he turned toward the door, he paused briefly. Then quietly, almost bitterly, he asked, "So what now?" I thought about that carefully. About fear, survival, rebuilding. About the terrified woman crying alone on her apartment kitchen floor months earlier. Then I answered honestly. "Now," I said softly, "I keep living." Daniel stared at me for a long moment. And for the first time since I met him all those years ago, he looked like the one who didn't know how to survive anymore. The morning of the second Rise Bakery grand opening began with sunlight pouring through the kitchen windows and absolute chaos inside the building. And honestly, I loved every second of it. Flour dust floated through the air while trays clattered, espresso machines hissed, and Denise yelled at someone for putting fresh pastries on the wrong cooling rack. "Blueberry muffins go left," she shouted dramatically. Janice rolled her eyes. "We've been open for 45 minutes, Denise, and standards matter." I laughed quietly while tying my apron. A year ago, I cried alone on a kitchen floor, convinced my life was over. Now, I stood inside my second bakery location, surrounded by women who felt like family. Life changes so strangely sometimes. The new storefront sat in a renovated historic building near downtown Columbus. Bigger kitchen, more seating, warm lighting, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the street. Naomi Walker believed the location could become our flagship store. I still struggled to think in words like flagship. Some days, I still felt like a frightened woman pretending to know what she was doing. But maybe confidence isn't something that arrives first. Maybe it's something built through repetition, one terrifying step at a time. The grand opening event was packed. Customers filled every table. Local reporters moved through the crowd. Community leaders, small business owners, and longtime customers lined up near the pastry displays. Even Ethan and Melissa arrived early to help. That alone would have been unimaginable a year earlier. Melissa adjusted flower arrangements nervously, while Ethan carried supply boxes from storage. Watching them work beside me stirred something emotional in my chest. Not because everything was magically healed. It wasn't. Trust rebuilds slowly. But we were trying, and after everything our family survived trying mattered. Around noon, Naomi pulled me aside near the kitchen. "You should prepare yourself." My stomach tightened instantly. For what, she glanced toward the front entrance carefully. "Media attention today will be heavier than usual." I frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Before Naomi could answer, I heard raised voices near the front of the bakery. My entire body tensed instantly, because I recognized Daniel's voice immediately. Even after all this time, some sounds still triggered survival instincts inside me. I moved quickly through the crowded dining area, and there he was, standing near the entrance in a wrinkled coat, visibly drunk. My heart dropped. Oh no. Customers stared openly, while Daniel argued with one of the event staff members, blocking his path farther inside. "You can't remove me from a public business," he snapped loudly. The smell of alcohol hit me before I even reached him. "Daniel." He turned immediately, and for one painful moment I barely recognized him. He looked exhausted, unshaven, angry in the hollow kind of way that comes after someone's entire life starts collapsing. "There she is," he said loudly. Every conversation inside the bakery quieted almost instantly. Tara, Ethan warned carefully from behind me. Daniel ignored him completely. "I just wanted to congratulate my ex-wife," he announced dramatically to the room. Embarrassment rushed through me immediately. "Daniel, you need to leave." He laughed harshly. Why afraid people might hear the truth? The room became painfully silent. I noticed customers pulling out phones. Recording. My stomach twisted. Not again. Not today. Daniel gestured wildly around the bakery. "She acts like she built this alone." I crossed my arms tightly. "I did build it." "No." He pointed directly at me. "You built this using my money." Several people exchanged uncomfortable looks. Ethan stepped forward immediately. "Dad, stop." Daniel rounded on him furiously. "Oh, now you're defending her." Melissa grabbed Ethan's arm nervously, but Daniel kept going. She wouldn't even have an apartment without the divorce settlement. Humiliation burned through me. Not because his words were true, because he still needed to publicly reduce me in order to feel powerful, even now. Even after everything. I took a slow breath. "You're drunk." Daniel scoffed loudly. "No, Tara. I'm honest." He pointed around the bakery again. "These people think you're some inspirational success story." The bitterness in his voice felt toxic. "But they don't know who really paid for all this." That's when Linda Hayes walked through the front entrance. Perfect timing, still carrying legal folders. Still terrifyingly calm. Daniel visibly froze the moment he saw her. Interesting. Linda approached slowly beside me. "Daniel." His jaw tightened instantly. "What are you doing here?" Linda glanced calmly around the crowded bakery. "Actually, I was invited." The room remained silent enough to hear silverware clink against plates. Daniel laughed bitterly. "Oh, perfect. The lawyer's here too." Then he turned back toward the customers. "Did Tara tell all of you how much money she got from me?" Something inside me finally stopped shrinking at that moment. Not angrily. Not emotionally. I just suddenly became tired. Tired of his performance. Tired of his manipulation. Tired of his endless need to rewrite reality. "You forged my signature," I said calmly. The room went dead silent. Daniel's face changed instantly. "What? You heard me!" His eyes flickered toward Linda immediately. Fear. Real fear this time. Linda stepped forward professionally. As your legal counsel already informed you, we have verified evidence of multiple fraudulent transfers tied to marital assets. Several customers gasped softly. Daniel's face reddened instantly. That's nonsense. No, Linda replied evenly. Actually, it's felony-level financial misconduct. The silence that followed felt enormous. Ethan stared at his father in shock, despite already knowing pieces of the truth. Melissa covered her mouth, and for the first time since all this began, Daniel no longer looked powerful. He looked exposed, dangerously exposed. You're trying to ruin me, he snapped toward me. I stared at him quietly. No, Daniel. Your choices did that. Something about hearing calm truth instead of emotional pleading seemed to destabilize him further. You think you're better than me now? He shouted. I shook my head slowly. No. I just finally stopped believing I was less than you. That landed hard enough that even he felt it. Daniel looked around desperately at the customers watching him now with discomfort instead of admiration. The illusion was breaking publicly in real time. For years he controlled the narrative. Successful businessman, provider, strong husband. And now people saw exactly what I lived with behind closed doors. A man terrified of losing control. Daniel suddenly pointed toward the pastry cases. This whole place is a joke. Nobody reacted. Not one person. No laughter. No agreement. Just silence. And somehow that silence felt louder than humiliation ever had. Because for the first time in his life, Daniel Robertson stood in a room where his authority meant absolutely nothing. His breathing grew uneven. Then finally, Ethan stepped forward. Dad. Daniel looked at him immediately. You need to leave. The words visibly shattered something inside him. Because Ethan had chosen. Not me over him. Truth over fear. Daniel stared at his son for several long seconds. Then slowly his shoulders sagged. Not dramatically. Just enough to reveal exhaustion underneath all the anger. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted silently for him. And right before reaching the door, he stopped briefly. Without looking back, he asked quietly, Was I really that terrible? The question broke my heart more than I expected. Because deep down, I think he genuinely didn't understand the damage he caused. I looked at the man I once loved more than anyone in the world. Then finally answered honestly, You spent years trying to convince me I was nothing without you. Silence. And eventually I said softly, You started believing your own cruelty was normal. Daniel lowered his head slightly. Then he walked out into the cold afternoon sunlight alone. The bakery remained silent long after the door closed behind him. Then suddenly, quietly, someone started clapping. A woman near the back. Then another person joined. Then another. Until the entire bakery filled with applause. Not for revenge. Not for humiliation. For survival. I stood there fighting tears while the sound echoed around me. And in that moment, I realized something profound. Daniel spent years trying to make me feel small in public. But the truth had finally done what I never could. It made him face himself. After the grand opening disaster, Daniel disappeared from public life almost overnight. No more smug Facebook posts. No more golf club dinners. No more carefully curated image of the confident provider who controlled every room he entered. People in Columbus talk, especially after public humiliation mixed with legal trouble. Within days, rumors spread everywhere. Financial fraud investigations, forgery allegations, hidden accounts, failed investments. Most of the details remained private legally, but enough surfaced that Daniel's reputation began collapsing piece by piece. And strangely, I didn't feel victorious. That surprised people sometimes. They expected rage from me, revenge, celebration. But the truth was much sadder than that. I wasn't watching an enemy fall. I was watching the man I once built my entire life around unravel in front of everyone. There's no joy in that, only grief. One rainy Sunday afternoon, Ethan came by the bakery after closing carrying takeout containers from my favorite Italian restaurant. "You've barely eaten all week," he said. I smiled faintly. "You sound like me." "Guess I inherited it." That made me laugh softly. We sat together at one of the empty front tables while rain streaked the windows outside. The bakery smelled like vanilla and coffee and fresh bread cooling in the kitchen. Home. That's what it felt like now. Not the big house Daniel once controlled. This place. This life. This peace. Ethan stared down at his food for a long time before finally speaking. "I went to see Dad yesterday." I looked up quietly. "How was he?" Ethan hesitated. "Bad." Something painful tightened in my chest despite everything. "What do you mean he's drinking a lot?" That didn't surprise me. "His lawyer dropped him," Ethan continued softly. "Apparently there's enough evidence now that criminal charges are possible." I closed my eyes briefly. Even after everything Daniel did, the thought still hurt. Because once upon a time, I would have protected him from consequences no matter what it cost me. That's the dangerous thing about loving someone deeply. You can lose yourself trying to save them from themselves. Ethan rubbed his hands together nervously. "He asked about you." I looked out the rainy windows. "What did you say? That you're okay?" Silence settled between us. Then Ethan's voice cracked slightly. "I'm sorry, Mom." I turned back toward him immediately. His eyes were red. "I should have protected you." Oh. That nearly broke me. Not because I needed the apology, because I realized how much guilt he'd been carrying alone. "You were his son?" I said gently. "I was an adult too." "Yes," I agreed softly. "But children don't magically stop being shaped by the homes they grow up in." Ethan looked down. "I thought Dad was strength." I swallowed hard. "So did I." He shook his head slowly. "But now I think he was just afraid all the time." That sentence lingered heavily between us. Because I think Ethan had finally understood the truth that took me decades to learn. Control is often just fear wearing confidence like a costume. Fear of inadequacy, fear of abandonment, fear of irrelevance. Daniel needed power because deep down he never learned how to feel worthy without it. And sadly, people like that often hurt everyone closest to them while trying desperately to avoid their own pain. A few days later, Melissa came to the bakery alone. That surprised me. She stood awkwardly near the counter, twisting her purse strap nervously while customers moved around behind her. "Do you have a minute?" she asked quietly. "Of course." We sat near the back corner where things were quieter. Melissa looked exhausted. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then finally she whispered, "I owe you an apology too." I stayed silent. Tears filled her eyes almost immediately. "I saw the way Daniel treated you for years." Her voice shook. "And I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere." Pain moved quietly through my chest. Because that's how these dynamics survive so long. Not always through cruelty. Sometimes through silence. Melissa wiped at her eyes quickly. "The truth is, I was scared of him too." I frowned slightly. "He intimidated you all the time. That surprised me less than it should have." Melissa stared down at the table. "If dinner wasn't perfect, He criticized me. She laughed bitterly. If I spent money on something unnecessary, he'd make comments. My chest tightened slowly. He made me feel small too. And suddenly, I understood something I hadn't fully seen before. Daniel's behavior wasn't isolated to our marriage. It radiated outward into every relationship around him. Melissa looked up at me carefully. I used to think you were weak for staying quiet. The honesty stung. Then she continued softly. But now I realize you were surviving. Tears burned behind my eyes instantly, because surviving is ugly sometimes, quiet, complicated. People judge women for staying without understanding how emotional erosion works slowly over years until you barely recognize your own instincts anymore. Melissa reached across the table carefully. I want you to know something. I waited quietly. You becoming successful scared me at first. I blinked. What? She laughed weakly through tears. Because if you could rebuild your life at 62, then maybe I couldn't keep using fear as an excuse to stay unhappy either? That hit me harder than she probably realized. Because I never intended to become some symbol for other women. I was just trying to survive heartbreak without disappearing completely. But maybe that's how courage spreads sometimes. Quietly. One honest life at a time. Weeks passed. The legal case against Daniel continued moving forward slowly. Linda kept me updated carefully, but I stopped asking for details after a while. Not because I forgave him entirely. Because obsession chains you emotionally to the very thing you're trying to escape. And I was finally learning how to live without emotional chains. One evening, after closing, Naomi and I sat together drinking coffee inside the empty bakery, while soft jazz played quietly through the speakers. You've changed, she observed calmly. I smiled faintly. I hope so. No, Naomi corrected gently. I mean fundamentally. I leaned back thoughtfully. I think I stopped apologizing for existing. Naomi laughed softly. That'll do it. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then she asked, Do you hate him? The question surprised me. I thought carefully before answering. No. Naomi raised an eyebrow slightly. Really? I looked around the bakery slowly, at the life rebuilt from ashes, at the warmth, the peace, the women laughing in the kitchen earlier that day. Then finally, I answered honestly. I think hating him would mean he still controls too much space inside me. Naomi smiled quietly. That's wisdom. Maybe. Or maybe I was just tired. Tired of pain. Tired of carrying old wounds like proof I survived them. The truth was, Daniel already lost. Not because of lawsuits. Not because of public humiliation. Because he spent decades trying to convince a woman she was nothing without him. And watched her become more herself after leaving. That kind of loss can't be repaired by money or reputation. Late that night, after everyone left, I stood alone in the bakery turning off lights one by one. Outside, snow drifted softly beneath the street lamps. I paused near the front window, looking at my reflection in the glass. And for the first time in years, I recognized the woman staring back at me. Not someone's wife, not someone's emotional shadow. Just Tara. Whole. Visible. Free. 3 years after my divorce, Second Rise Bakery had 4 locations across Ohio. Sometimes saying that out loud still feels surreal, not because I doubt it anymore, but because I remember exactly who I was when this story began. A woman sitting silently at a dinner table while her husband laughed about how helpless she'd be without him. A woman who believed survival depended on staying small enough to keep everyone else comfortable. Now my mornings began before sunrise, with coffee inventory meetings and warm kitchens filled with women rebuilding their own lives. Janice managed one location. Denise trained new staff. Melissa eventually left her corporate job and began handling community outreach programs for the bakery. And perhaps my favorite part of all, we started a paid apprenticeship program for women over 50 trying to re-enter the workforce after divorce, widowhood, or long-term caregiving. Because I learned something powerful during my own rebuilding. Women are not too old to begin again. They're often just too exhausted from carrying everyone else for decades. The bakery became more than a business. It became proof. Proof that worth doesn't disappear with age. Proof that emotional survival can become transformation. Proof that starting over doesn't mean your life ended. Sometimes it means your real life finally begins. One autumn afternoon, I stood outside our newest location in Cincinnati, watching employees unload boxes while orange leaves drifted across the sidewalk. Naomi walked beside me, sipping coffee. "You know," she said casually, "you've become annoyingly inspirational." I laughed softly. "That sounds painful for you." "It is." She smiled. Then her expression shifted slightly. "There's something else." My stomach tightened immediately. What Naomi handed me an envelope, no return address. The moment I saw the handwriting, my chest tightened. Daniel. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 8 months. The legal situation eventually settled quietly. Daniel avoided criminal charges through financial agreements and restitution arrangements negotiated by his attorneys, but his reputation never fully recovered. He sold the house, lost several business partnerships, and according to Ethan, lived alone now in a much smaller condo outside the city. I stared at the envelope for several long seconds before opening it. "Tara, I don't know if you'll read this." I almost stopped there, but something inside me needed to know. "I was wrong about you." The words blurred briefly as emotion tightened unexpectedly in my chest. Not because they fixed anything. Some apologies arrived too late to repair the damage they caused. Still, there's something deeply human about finally being seen clearly by someone who once made you invisible. The letter continued. "I spent most of my life believing control was the same thing as strength. I thought if I made myself important enough, successful enough, necessary enough, then nobody could leave me. Instead, I became someone who pushed away the people who loved me most." I sat down slowly on a nearby bench while reading. "I know I hurt you. I know I diminished you. And the hardest part now is realizing you were always stronger than me." Tears stung unexpectedly behind my eyes. Because once upon a time, hearing those words would have meant everything. Now, they simply felt sad. At the bottom of the letter, Daniel wrote one final sentence. "If you're willing, I'd like to see you once more before it's too late." I stared at the page for a very long time, then finally folded it carefully. Naomi watched me quietly. "You okay?" I nodded slowly. "I think so." "Are you going to see him?" I honestly didn't know. For several days, the question followed me everywhere. While reviewing bakery orders, while laughing with staff, while sitting alone at night. Part of me feared reopening old wounds. Another part understood something important. Closure and reconciliation are not the same thing. You can release pain without returning to the person who caused it. A week later, I finally agreed to meet Daniel at a quiet park near the river, where we used to walk when Ethan was little. The afternoon air felt cool and crisp as I approached the bench where he sat waiting. For a second, my heart ached unexpectedly. Not from love, from time. Daniel looked older now, not just physically, spiritually. Like life had finally forced him to stop performing strength and simply sit inside himself honestly. He stood awkwardly when he saw me. "Hi, Tara. Hi." For a moment, neither of us knew what to say. Then Daniel gave a small, sad smile. "You look happy." I thought about that carefully, because happiness used to feel impossible for me. Not dramatic happiness, not movie happiness, just peace. Simple peace. I answered honestly. Daniel nodded slowly. I'm glad. We sat quietly on the bench while leaves drifted across the walking path. Finally, Daniel spoke again. I used to think if you ever left me, you'd fall apart. I looked toward the river. I know. He swallowed hard. But the truth is, I was the one terrified of being alone. That honesty mattered, not because it erased the past, because it was real. Maybe for the first time in decades. Daniel rubbed his hands together slowly. You know what scares me most now? I waited quietly. That I wasted so many years needing to feel superior instead of simply loving the people around me. His voice cracked slightly, and despite everything, compassion moved gently through me. Not romantic love, not longing, just compassion for two people who lost themselves inside a marriage neither of them fully understood until it broke apart. I did love you, he whispered. I nodded slowly. I know, and I think you loved me too. I did. The honesty felt strangely peaceful now, because healing finally allowed truth to exist without destroying me. Daniel looked at me carefully. Do you think you'll ever forgive me completely? I thought about all the versions of myself that existed between us. The young woman at the bakery counter, the exhausted wife shrinking at dinner tables, the terrified divorcee crying on an apartment floor, the business owner rebuilding her life from nothing. Then finally, I answered honestly. I think forgiveness isn't forgetting what happened. Daniel stayed silent. I think it's refusing to let pain become your identity forever. Tears filled his eyes unexpectedly, and suddenly I realized something profound. For years I believed surviving Daniel meant escaping him. But true healing happened when I stopped needing him to become a different person in order for me to finally feel whole. The sun slowly dipped lower across the river. Daniel exhaled shakily. You became richer after the divorce. I laughed softly. Yeah. He smiled faintly, but not because of the money. I looked at him quietly. No, I agreed. Not because of the money. Because wealth isn't always financial. Sometimes wealth is waking up without fear. Sometimes wealth is rediscovering your voice after decades of silence. Sometimes wealth is realizing your life still belongs to you, no matter how late you begin again. And as I stood to leave that afternoon, I understood something with absolute certainty. Daniel Robertson once believed I could never survive without him. But the truth was, the moment I stopped believing his version of me, I finally became free enough to build a life richer than anything I ever imagined. If there's one thing I hope you take away from my story, it's this: never confuse dependence with love. Real love does not shrink you. It does not humiliate you. It does not require you to become smaller so someone else can feel important. And no matter your age, no matter how many years you've already spent surviving, it is never too late to rebuild your life. Sometimes the end of one chapter feels like destruction when it first happens. But later, you realize it was rescue. I thought divorce at 62 would ruin me. Instead, it forced me to meet the version of myself I abandoned decades earlier. The woman who still had dreams, still had talent, still had value. So if you're watching this while feeling trapped, invisible, unloved, or afraid to start over, please hear me carefully. Your life is not over, and your worth was never dependent on someone else's ability to recognize it. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe to the channel. and I'd truly love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to rebuild your life after someone made you feel small? Where are you watching from today, and what time is it there right now? I read every single comment, and your stories mean more to me than you know.